I believe after reviewing the new evidence that Mr. likely meets a diagnostic criteria for narcissistic personality disorder.
158, you would have redirect, given the scope of cross was expanded to direct. Mr.
Yes.
King, do you have any?
Yes. Do you have a safe for your guns?
Yes.
And is the number, are they all kept in the safe?
Yes.
And does it lock?
Yes.
And how do you unlock it?
With a code, numerical code,
Several digits?
between 4 and 6.
Okay. In the MDX, did the dog go out the driver's window, passenger's window, or back seat?
Back seat.
Okay, on the side that, well, what was in the middle or on one of the sides?
Who's behind the passenger?
So he was on the right side.
Correct.
Is that the window that the dog went out, or is it the other back seat?
Who's the other window?
To the left, to the left.
Correct.
That's where it went.
Yes.
Okay. And this was, the dog stepped on the button and it opened the window.
Yes.
I want to make sure that I have this clear. There's a baby monitor, or was a baby monitor in the home.
Yes.
And the baby monitor consisted of what? Was there two things, a giver and a receiver unit, or what?
Yes, there was a camera and then there was a handheld, so you could see the video camera via the handheld.
Okay, was the handheld just to watch, or could it record pictures as well?
I don't know if it could record.
Okay. Now, besides this baby monitor, was there any other cameras that could be used for surveillance or anything else inside the house?
No.
How many tests did you take regarding alcohol or drugs?
I've taken 5 now.
Did you feel any of them?
No.
Objection. He's a lay witness, he does not qualify to answer that question.
Mr. King?
He most certainly can. Again, this is not that doctor thing, we're trying to diagnose ourselves, but he certainly can answer whether he passed or failed.
It would be within his personal knowledge as to whether or not he believes he passed or failed. He's not being called as an expert about the testing. So as to that objection is overruled. Any others, Ms. Fred Cooper?
No.
Go ahead.
Was the testing just for alcohol or for drugs or for both?
For alcohol.
How many times did you meet with Dr. Coard?
Two or three, I believe.
Did he ever speak words to the effect that he hadn't completed the testing?
No.
I don't have any other questions.
Mr. Thank you very much. Go ahead and have a seat at the council table. Ms. Brady Cooper, who would you like to call as your next witness? You're waiting for Dr. Coard?
Yeah, that is our only, witness, other than the woman who's not available till tomorrow morning, so maybe I can check in and see what his status is, if possible.
Absolutely. And can you all just tell me at this point, Mr. King, you don't have any other witnesses, correct? So you're going to be spending the rest of your time on cross-examination on Ms. Hardy Cooper's witnesses. Do I have that correct?
Right, and if there's any rebuttal witnesses or something.
Okay. And then we'll have that argument if or when. But right now, you're waiting for Dr. Coard and the other witness. Those are the only 2 witnesses that you have remaining.
Correct.
So there's nobody that we can take out of order
Right.
in the interest of time right now, is what I'm hearing.
Right.
Okay. Why don't you go ahead and take a recess so that you can make those calls. Ms. Hardy Cooper, please just keep Mr. King informed as to whatever information you learn.
Sure.
I'm not gonna make people come back in here just so that we can all look at each other. If you find out that Dr. Coard is gonna be available at 2:30, just let Mr. King know. We'll come in as soon as we have a witness. We'll be in recess until then. We'll make an announcement in the lobby so that people can kind of be up here on the third floor or otherwise a few minutes before we reconvene, just so that people don't have to necessarily sit in here. And then, Mr. King, you were gonna give me some case numbers related to other cases, if, completely unrelated to this case.
Yes.
If you wanna get those to my staff, I'll take a look at them.
Okay, but I probably need to explain a little bit too. But
Okay, so during the break, Ms. Hardy Cooper, if Mr. King asks me a question about a different unrelated case, any objection?
I have no objection.
All right, go ahead and take your recess and a break. We'll make an announcement before we reconvene, and we're in recess now, so those lights will go off. You're welcome to stay here or step out. You don't have to step out just because we're in a break, but you're welcome to stay there or not.
you just want to do something?
Do you mind if I have a case number?
Yeah.
please?
Well,
Record in DD 11-0. It is 2:47 PM. Ms. Hardy Cooper, who would you like to call as your next witness?
Yeah, just a moment to grab something.
Please.
Thanks. Okay, thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to call Dr. Herbert Coard, please.
Mr. Coard, or Dr. Coard, if you wouldn't mind taking this step.
Do you solemnly affirm the evidence and testimony you're about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Go ahead and have a seat. At your leisure.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Will you please state your name for the record? Oh, sorry, I've not read my jacket. Back again. He was just so nice without the jacket.
Herbert F. Coard, Coard, Roman numeral number 3.
And then Dr. Coard, where did you go to school?
I have a doctoral degree from the University of Missouri in St. Louis. I have a respecialization in clinical psychology from Rosalind Franklin School of Medicine in Illinois.
Okay, and then what postgraduate experience do you have?
Postgraduate experience, well, part of my respecialization was completing a clinical psychology internship with the United States Navy. And then after that, I became licensed and have been licensed for 20 plus years.
Okay, have you testified as an expert before?
I have.
In what jurisdictions?
This jurisdiction, I think, all the jurisdictions across northern Nevada, Clark County, I've testified there. I've testified in Nye County, Carson, and then I've also testified in federal district court across the United States.
Testified in criminal cases,
Criminal cases, yes.
for both sides?
For both sides, yes.
And then also testimony with child custody cases?
Yes.
I realized this, Your Honor, earlier we didn't mark his CV for exhibit. I provided a copy to Mr. King. It was also attached to the motion to order the parental fitness evaluation. Somebody mark this?
28. .28 is CV and it's been marked. 250.
Dr. Coard, is this your current CV?
Yes, it is.
I would move to admit 28 and tender Dr. Coard as an expert.
Mayor, I vote
Go ahead.
aye. You went through a series of things that you testified in. Can you estimate the number of child custody cases that you testified in?
Are you describing this as a child custody case?
Yes, I
Child custody cases, I have about 7 full child custody cases. I don't see as a child custody case because I'm ultimately not making a recommendation associated with the custody of the child. Parental capacity / parental fitness. I have probably testified in about 15 of those cases with the family division, and then I've also testified in a number of cases related to parental capacity in 432B matters, both in Carson City here and Elko.
And approximately how many of those cases that you just described would have been within the state of Nevada?
All of my family stuff has been in the state of Nevada.
All right. That's all the questions I have, Your Honor.
Any objection then to tendering as an expert?
Yeah, no.
Any objection to admission of Exhibit 28?
No.
Exhibit 28 is deemed admitted.
Dr. Coard, were you appointed to do a parental fitness evaluation in this case?
I was
Of whom?
by the judge in this case.
And what was the parent that you were doing the evaluation of?
It was Mr.
Okay. And then what were the concerns at that time?
There had been an episode that was described as very upsetting to the minor child in this case, in which he did not want to return to dad's custody because of fear.
Okay, and then,
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I correct the record just to make sure that my memory serves? Is that I didn't appoint anyone?
right,
I granted a Rule 35 request.
That's right.
There is no court-ordered expert. Is that?
thank you,
okay.
that's accurate.
Corrected for the record, and we do not have Exhibit 28 up here, so if, do you have it at the witness stand?
Would you like me to bring it back?
Do we have a second copy? That's okay.
Sure.
If we don't, that's fine too, I just want to make sure that I know where they're at. Okay, thank you very much for that. My apologies for the interruption. Thank you.
Okay, so you were hired by Ms. to do a parental fitness evaluation of Mr.
That's correct.
Okay, and what did she ask you to do?
So basically, I defined what a parental capacity or parental fitness evaluation looked like in a consent, and then we also identified some questions that could be addressed as potentially part of the effort of looking at parental capacity.
Were you informed of what her ultimate goal was?
Yes.
And what was that?
She wanted to return her son as soon as possible to his father, but was concerned about safety and the needs for his emotional, and for dad to be able to meet his emotional needs.
Okay. So in the parental fitness evaluation, did you interview folks?
I did.
Who did you interview?
So I interviewed mom in this case, I interviewed dad in the case, I interviewed Lindsay, Mr. second wife, as part of this process, and I also interviewed the minor child.
And then did you review a number of documents?
I did.
Did you list those documents in your evaluation
I did.
dated May 30th, 2024?
I did.
Okay. I'm not sure, I believe you have an exhibit book to the far right of you.
I do.
Okay. Could you look at exhibit 1, please?
Okay, I'm there.
Okay. Is this your evaluation that you reported as of May 30th, 2024?
I'm sorry, I need to just look at the. Yes, this is my signed copy of a parental fitness evaluation dated May 30th, 2024.
Okay. Among the issues that Ms. raised involved domestic violence, is that correct?
Yes,
Sexual, physical violence,
yes,
also emotional violence.
yes.
What else did she identify?
She identified some patterns of the interactional patterns that she was concerned about related to Mr. and his son, and the, I'm trying to think of what the other. The main concerns that she had to do with the fear and the fact that he was potentially at danger if he went back, because he had told Miss that if he had to go back to Dad, that he was going to run away. He also told me that too.
Okay. Did she describe violence towards animals?
She did.
And then did you talk to her about those concerns?
I did.
Okay. What did you think about her concerns of domestic violence at that time?
There was clearly an emotional response on this part about, as she described, what she had perceived as horrific forms of both physical and sexual violence that were perpetrated against her, against Mr. But I
Against her or against Mr.
that Mr. had perpetrated against her. Sorry. And for and that's, she was one of the first she's one of the first collateral interviews to understand the dynamics and what had occurred. The child also was primarily in her custody at that point in time, so she had the most current kind of developmental information and psychosocial information about the minor child. But I mean, people tell me stuff all the time, and I didn't have the other side of the story at this point in time.
Mm-hmm.
It was certainly questions that needed to be asked of Mr. Related to what Ms. had reported about a gun and sexual violence, being forced at gunpoint to write a letter. All those things were things that ultimately were discussed with Mr.
Was she also concerned that he had had some suicidal threats or ideation?
Yeah, she'd said that there had been an episode, there had been at least one episode where that was a concern.
Okay. Now, what you described earlier sounded like the historical, older domestic violence concerns, is that right?
Yeah, at that point in time, those allegations are 14, 15 years old. I mean, I did take note that the level of emotional response to those 15-year-old allegations were significant, and obviously she indicated that she had she was going through the process of therapy to try to address those issues. So that was noted, but like I said, I only had one side of the story at that point in time.
And then she also talked to you about, did she talk to you about a letter that Mr. had forced her to write?
Yes.
Okay. Did she discuss her belief that, well, what he had told her in the past, that he was going to release that at a later time so that everyone would hate her, and at that point he would kill her?
Yes, she did indicate that, and the letter and how it had been described to Miss on an ongoing basis was one in which appeared to be an assertion of Mr. for power and control over Ms.
Okay. Were you made aware of the fact that she suffered from cancer in 2022?
Yes,
Do you recall the issue between the parties related to the right of first refusal?
I do.
What was that issue?
So Mr. appears, from what I kind of reading between the lines here, is that he was using the right of first refusal to obtain information about Ms. health condition by having the right to be able to have his son when she may be receiving treatment and things of that nature. And so it was another example, I viewed it as another example of power and control.
And you're aware that Ms. had to file a motion on that issue?
I am.
And then are you aware whether Mr. Opposed it?
I
Can't recall?
can't recall. I believe that he did. I won't say.
You could review, is there anything that would refresh your recollection? Are you looking at your report, sir?
I am. I'm looking at the records that I reviewed.
believe this is something that you address in your report, and so if you need to take a look at your report to refresh your recollection, just let us know if that's what you're doing.
Could you tell me what section?
It's on page 2 at the bottom.
I see that Mr. did not oppose that motion.
Okay, and what did he do instead?
He sent her an OFW message, basically talking about not being able to afford extra expenses, no longer attempting to charge me for these things which I can't afford. Please stop rubbing it in my face that you're more affluent than I am, and you are an awful human being, belittling me. I am glad God gave you cancer.
Okay, so you were provided a number of Our Family Wizard messages by Ms. Side, is that right?
That's correct.
Did Mr. also have an opportunity to show Family Wizard messages to you?
He was.
Okay, did he provide any messages during that time that support that statement he made?
No.
Did he provide you any Family Wizard messages to support any of what he told you at his, in his interviews?
He didn't.
You're aware that was seen by therapist Jerry Cottard, is that correct?
Yes.
What was Mr. opinion of Ms. Cottard?
He did not find her a good therapist and thought that she was going against his interest.
Did you talk to Mr. about some voicemails that he had left for her at the time of the right of first refusal motion?
Yes.
And can you tell us about that conversation?
I talked to him about those voicemails, and initially he was kind of guarded. Yeah, I was upset, and then I asked him more in detail about, like, what was your tone of voice like? How would she have perceived your message? What was your purpose of your disdain for Ms. Goddard? And he kind of, he admitted that he probably was. Throughout this evaluation, there were a number of points where questioning him about these things, like, I could get Mr. to a point where he would have a moment of insight, like, hey, maybe I shouldn't have done this. But then it would kind of flee away if he talked about it again. And that lack of insight was fairly consistent in many of the confrontations, or kind of, hey, why'd you do this?
So did that happen with respect to those voicemails?
Yes.
Did Mr. say whether he was impaired or not?
Yes, he did say that he was impaired.
Can you think of other times when there were these moments of insight that then were lost?
It was brought up to Mr. One of the concerns that were expressed was that he wanted these proceedings to be open to the public, which I brought to him and basically said, you realize what that means for you? And he's like, yeah, well, people need to know about her. I said, well, have you thought about it from your son's perspective? Because it'll last on the internet forever. And he might be able to see these things. And at that moment, he kind of said, I didn't think about it that way. And he said that he would talk to his attorney to have the proceedings closed because of it.
Any other examples that you could about the moment of insight that was lost?
During the parent-child interaction, afterwards, there was opportunity for us to talk, and he kind of there was some emotional release that happened with the minor child and dad as part of the kind of clearing the air about certain things, and he kind of said, I didn't realize that he was feeling that intensely. I didn't realize that he was so anxious about these things. He did do a good job of reassuring him, because one of the things that the minor child was concerned was that, and this was much more of his anticipatory anxiety that things were going to get worse, didn't know what the kind of worst thing that could happen. But when Mr. kind of clarified, I never do anything to harm you, and I looked at him and I said, what does that mean that you didn't recognize that your son actually was feeling like you were going to go and harm him? And he immediately said, I would never do that. But it was like it had to get to that point that he had to recognize that his behavior could be viewed in a different way. Another example of kind of a lack of insight to how he responds to others.
Okay, does that cover it, or is there anything else to add?
I think that's all that I can think of.
Okay, when you talk to Ms. Perkins, in your report you write that she alleged some level of verbal and psychological abuse from Mr. Can you tell us what she talked about?
Yes. So one, in even his description and also Ms. Perkins' kind of description of herself, I get a much more secure woman who would be not kind of put up with stuff, but at the same time she put up with some stuff with him. I guess the dog that they had together, which I guess was her dog that she brought into the relationship, was getting old, and it peed on the bed, I believe, or peed in the bedroom. I think it was the bed, and he put the dog outside and told her that the dog couldn't come inside, and as a result of that, because it was a prized possession of hers, she actually stayed at the door all night to make sure the dog was okay.
So she testified regarding that incident, but it wasn't, what she testified wasn't related to peeing in the bed. She testified it was related to an interaction with pulling the whiskers. Are you thinking about something different?
No, that's what Mr. Told me about why the dog was outside. I don't remember what she said about the.
Oh, the peeing in the bed, that's why he said it was okay. Did Mr. acknowledge some level of emotional or verbal abuse of Ms. Perkins?
Yes,
Okay, and do you recall examples of that?
I'd have to look at my report for example.
Okay. If that will refresh your recollection.
Okay. What page would you like me to look at?
On page 5, relationship history. The last sentence of that paragraph reads, in both relationships he denied a history of physical violence, but does admit that there was emotional abuse that was directed towards both wives. It included gaslighting and making verbally abusive statements toward them, for which he has some recognition.
Yes.
What are some examples of the gaslighting?
Well, I think the first thing that pops to mind that even during the evaluation, I had to tell he would refer to Miss as a bitch as part of the during the evaluation, which was one of those behaviors that I kind of corrected and said, this may be one of those barriers that's making it difficult for you to work with Miss. I didn't have the whole picture at that point in time, but there does appear for both of them that there is this kind of pattern of like it's their problem. There's minimal responsibility on his part to say, hey, I contributed to this problem. It's always when he gets angry, what appears to happen based off of what I reviewed and in some recent evidence that I was able to look at, that when he gets angry, he projects that anger onto others and blames others as a result, that it's a result of their failure, not his, which is very consistent with someone who just can't tolerate that there's something wrong with them.
You referenced recent evidence. Are you referring to the exhibits that were admitted in this case as part of the trial?
Yes, some of, to describe them, a lot of them were earlier text messages that were, somewhat dated, but when we were discussing some of the patterns that we were having, it then allowed me to kind of go back and say, oh wow, I have a lot more evidence of what I, didn't necessarily have before.
Okay. And so what did you have evidence of? What was your assessment of those text messages?
I mean, I think I go back to what I said earlier, that I only had one side of the story about abuse, domestic violence, sexual abuse, and I didn't have Mr. Side of the story. Obviously, there are some concerning things, him calling her a bitch during the evaluation. Usually, people are on their best behavior during that period of time. But he vehemently denied all types of abuse with both of the wives. He kind of said, yeah, maybe I emotionally, was abusive, but even the types of examples that he was willing to kind of, own up were kind of the minor types of things that we would see. But what I saw when I reviewed those older things is I started seeing a very similar pattern, a lot more intense in his communications with Miss. And the more striking component to me was that it looked a lot like the interaction that happened in February between Mr. and the minor child.
Will you please take a look at Exhibit 27? I think it's up there. And maybe with the clerk? Yeah, for sure. Judge Court, this was admitted earlier and confirmed by Mr. that this was the text communications that happened on February 4th.
Yes,
Do you see where that is?
I do.
Okay. And so do you see that the first text is at 3:05 p.m.? Are you playing your Xbox right now?
Yes.
And then at 6:01, it says, call me, I'm sick of you ignoring me.
Yes.
I can make the representation to you that Ms. will acknowledge that he and spoke between 6 and 7 p.m., at which point he then sent a series of or our family wizard messages to Ms. which you've reviewed as well.
Correct.
So is there a parallel that you see with this communication and the other information that you have about their call to what has happened with Ms. in the past?
Yeah, I think this is kind of that pattern that, he thinks that he needs this answer immediately. If he doesn't get an answer as a result of it, I think he perceives it as some level of disrespect towards him. And he doesn't necessarily consider alternative hypothesis, like, this is a 14-year-old boy. At this point, or 13-year-old at the time. You know what? He's probably not going to answer a text. It was also a snow day. All the contextual factors at this point in time, he probably isn't going to answer immediately. And then to respond, how do you come to the conclusion that you're sick, call me, I'm sick of you ignoring me? Is this a reference to the fact that you didn't answer, or is there a pattern of him not ignoring, ignoring him? But I mean, this to me is, a young teenager starting to display a level of autonomy, and I don't have to be in contact with mom and dad immediately. Delays in messages like that are pretty typical.
Mr. also testified that he let know that there would be a punishment and consequences for this during that telephone call. Do you see a parallel with that, with the information you have about his interactions with?
Yeah, he's driving compliance. If you don't do it, there's something bad gonna happen.
And did you see that in the communications with?
There were tons of examples.
Did Mr. tell you whether he was impaired when he made that telephone call? Well, when he talked on the telephone with?
He did. He wasn't.
Was intoxicated,
Yes.
or was that impaired? I said impaired, you can correct me which one he said. Was it impaired or intoxicated?
I think it was intoxicating.
Okay, so then with Ms. So going through the report, you did a series of tools and assessment on Mr. correct?
That's correct.
Okay, was Mr. compliant with that testing?
For the most part, yes.
Okay, what did you determine as a result of that testing?
So the motor psychopathology testing, which is the MMPI, indicated that, and this is not necessarily unusual, that he is trying to kind of report himself as things are great, better than maybe they really are. But overall, the psychopathology stuff seemed to be less concerning. There was some concerns when we talk about behavioral dysfunction, in particularly about his report about engaging in physical aggression, violent behavior, losing control, and liking to have a history of violence towards others based on his profile. And so violence was one of those things, and aggression was one of those areas that was elevated. And there's also kind of this, other pattern that seems to match these text messages that when people do you wrong, he endorsed, I feel that I should pay them back, which is very consistent with the messages that he was doing with Miss. And I would argue that the text messaging that occurred on February 4th is also one example of that behavior.
Was Mr. Focused on the fling or affair that she had?
Yeah, a great detail.
Okay, tell me more about that.
He was adversely affected by the affair, and really seemed to not be able to move on. There was a lot of questions that he had, and then with Miss getting pregnant shortly after the affair, it led to a lot of uncertainty for Mr. about who the father was of the child throughout the pregnancy, and that was certainly something that caused him some harm, psychological harm during that period of time. And he was just almost hyper focused on the idea that this happened and his ability to kind of move on. And the use of the letter was really this, which according to Mr. was done at gunpoint, which Mr. denies, was an intent to assert some level of power or control and to demonstrate to Miss that her life was in his hands.
And so he continued to have that focus. You said that early on, and that was still continuing in the evaluation?
Yes, and I mean, at a certain point in time, I believe I kind of said, I got that part. I understand the pieces, and just his ability to just let it go was just not there.
Okay, and then you also saw that our family visited messages in 2022 and 2023 relating, that he sent to her relating to that, right?
That it comes back up again. One of the things I tried to look for is are there antecedents to, like, for this to come up? Is there anniversary related? Is it something that's going on in Mr. J? To the extent that he would, open up about those things. I couldn't find, any like true kind of nexus that, there's a conflict and he brings it back up as an attempt to manipulate a situation. I didn't see that. I think it's that he has this, and he feels like it provides him in a kind of a grandiose sense, a sense of control over, even though they've been divorced for years.
Did Ms. Perkins talk to you about about her experience with Mr. As it relates to his opinions?
Yes.
Okay, and what did she tell you?
Well, he definitely would at times draw parallels between Miss Perkins and Miss. And if Miss came up in a discussion, Mr. I think in how she described it, he would lose his shit. Just describing kind of this violent kind of I wouldn't call it violent, but just an over the top emotional response as a result of something that would do. She also at one point in time described at least one occasion where he was really angry about something that he did. I don't necessarily know what did, but she felt that she needed to take the minor kid out of the home in order to give him an opportunity to kind of cool down.
Did she talk to you about her belief of whether she was able to calm him during that time?
She said she was unable to, but there were times when she could.
In the course of your evaluation, did Mr. provide you with a letter from his counselor, Siobhan Collins?
I believe he did.
Okay. You referenced the letter in your report on page 6. With respect to his report about that therapy with Ms. Collins, what was it focused on?
His focus primarily on his gripes about Miss.
Okay. Will you look at page 6 and look at the italicized part and let me know whether that is a quote from her letter?
It is.
Will you read that out loud, please?
While in therapy, he is working on improving his mental health condition to work on decreasing his depression and anxiety. He presents with a lot of anxiety that stems from issues that have resolved around his marriage, their divorce, and her behavior that he directed towards. While in therapy, he has never shown any signs of being physically abused, period. I have the pleasure of meeting his son during one of our therapy appointments. He could be happy and comfortable with his dad. There are no signs of abuse or even concerns of abuse.
Did Mr. tell you what her behavior that is directed towards means?
Yeah, it's all about the abuse. It's all about the affair.
Did Mr. also express his frustration with her requests regarding co-parenting on family visitor?
Yeah, he talked about that. And the problem that I had with it is that most of the things, and he mentioned some number like 100 and something was part of that discussion. Most of them, over a large period of time, most of them seem like more, what I would, parents should communicate if family members come in or there's a change or something like that. But Mr. just sees it more as like Miss fucking with them, and that's his words.
In your evaluation, you found that Mr. had a substance use disorder with respect to alcohol and marijuana. Can you tell us why that is?
Well, so when we talk about substance use disorders, we talk about you can look at a variety of different symptoms that an individual might have, but more importantly, we start looking at the impact that the use of the substances have on their behavior. You can look at occupationally, personal, relationships with his son. And so for alcohol, I think that he is having some moderate difficulties. And at the time, he reported that he hadn't used alcohol in a while. And cannabis was more of a milder problem. He's one of those that I kind of describe as it's recreational marijuana or I'm using it for medical purposes, even though typically those assertions about medical use are not well based in science.
Did he present you with a medical prescription for marijuana?
I'm not sure if he did or not.
During that observed interaction that you talked about between Mr. Did he tell him that he hadn't used alcohol for some time?
Yes.
And did he also tell him that he had been testing for alcohol?
The testing was discussed, yes.
Under your section regarding the MMPI that you discussed, in the paragraph at the top, you talk about preoccupation with disappointments, and there is evidence to suggest rigidity and a need for perfectionism. How is that relevant to parenting?
Well, unfortunately, if you're trying to be a perfect parent, good luck with that. We have to have some flexibility in the way in which we deal with kids, and especially within the context of kind of the developmental level of the child. We have to have a lot of flexibility with kind of infants and toddlers. School years, we can have less flexibility, but certainly when we start talking about adolescence, it's time to be flexible and understand versus just demand and have expectations that they have to meet your requirements.
Okay. You already talked about the incident on February 4th, but was there anything else in your interaction with your interviews and evaluation with respect to and why this would be a concern?
He sees it as a concern. And the other part about this is that, we have to remember that this is an interaction between a parent and the minor child. And the reason that that's important is that I believe that anxiety is a pretty significant concern for the minor child in this case. And so parents need to be careful about how they interact and how they respond in order not to facilitate greater levels of anxiety.
Did he tell you that he believes his father would hurt him that day on February 4th?
He did.
Did he also say that if he was forced to go back to his father's house, he would run away?
When I talked with him individually, yes.
Okay. Did he tell you that he had a safety plan for his brother and him if his father came to the house with guns?
Yes.
Within that next paragraph, you talk about behavioral dysfunction, which you talked about a bit earlier, you touched on. And in that, you say, Mr. reported engaging in physically aggressive, violent behavior and losing control. It's likely that he has a history of violent behavior towards others based on his profile. Can you tell us your basis for that?
Okay, so this is based off of, the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic, is a test that's been around forever. And so what we have is we have known people who have actually engaged in those types of behavior. And we have a profile that suggests that an individual is more likely to engage that way. And it really depends, there's no absolute to it, but it says that he meets a pattern. And we don't just use psychological testing in isolation. But those patterns, some of those statements seem to be fairly consistent with kind of the totality of all the evidence that was here.
In the course of your evaluation, did you attempt to mediate a deal for these folks?
Absolutely. I don't want, Mr. clearly indicates that he has a desire to be with his child. I saw a level of affection between the two after we had some clarification. And I was hoping that we could resolve a lot of these issues, but obviously we didn't. We're here.
So did he initially indicate that he was interested in that?
He did.
Okay, and then did he follow through with that?
He did not. Well, there's one part I don't know for sure. I should be careful about that.
Okay, go ahead and tell me.
the space program, both parents were provided a book, a recommendation of a book to address the anxiety that we were seeing in the minor child. I know that Ms. read it because she ended up giving me some feedback that she was finding it very helpful and she was seeing some decrease in his anxiety. I'm not sure if Ms. followed through with that recommendation or not.
In that next section, you're talking about the parent interview and child development.
Yeah.
And I see that you said that you expressed concerns that makes decisions about activities for with little consultation, and he feels he cannot change that decision without experiencing negative ramifications. Then you say he was unable to provide any OFW messages that provided evidence. Did he provide anything other than his words that corroborated that belief?
There was nothing.
On page 9, you're talking about discipline techniques.
Yes.
And you say there was some indication that he does not recognize and regulate his own feelings and behaviors before responding. He did have some ability to imagine point of view, but seems not to understand the emotional underpinnings of responses. What do you mean by that?
So one of the things is that was the conversation we talked about a little bit earlier about recognizing the level or the extent of his anxiety in a situation.
Anxiety?
Correct. And the other part is that as the minor child kind of described it, there was interest. There was the interaction sometimes was that Mr. would kind of approach him in a way that would potentially increase an anxious response, and then the minor child unfortunately was engaged in a lot of kind of worst case scenario types of stuff, which he wasn't really openly telling people about, but he was doing a lot of that. But this is one of those things, like, as a parent, recognizing there's kind of two ways in which parents deal with anxiety. And one, we call it parental accommodation, which is where parents will actually allow their child to avoid an anxious thing, which is something that I did see with Miss. And I should say that that's the typical response. Most parents don't necessarily understand this idea about the accommodation, because initially parents should respond and, oh my God, my kid's uncomfortable, I'm going to help them be not uncomfortable, not realizing that allowing them to avoid it actually reinforces the anxiety, because there really is nothing to worry about. The other response that parents have, which seems to be more consistent with Mr. is a lack of validation of the anxiety, maybe because he can't recognize the anxiety, and then potentially saying everything's going to be okay, but not really providing that emotional support.
Okay. Your next section is you're talking about the parent stress screening instruments for
Yes.
interactions with adolescents. How does that test work?
So this was done electronically, so that's sent to him, in which he is then asked to answer a series of questions that address adolescent and kind of interaction between the parent and the child.
Okay, and then what are the options that the person taking the test has with each question?
They cannot answer a question if they choose not to.
Do they push like the skip button or what?
Well, yeah, I forget how it works, but you don't have to answer every question. You're able to go, and it does not. I don't believe it has a skip button. I think it's just you push the button and you move on.
Okay, and so when I'm looking at your scale and it shows there's some blanks. Why is that?
The reason for those blanks would be because not enough items were answered in that section. So we don't like, so for example, this has to do with, let's pick delinquency and antisocial. It's not like we have the first section is delinquency and antisocial. Those questions are peppered throughout the questionnaire. Set away, people don't, they're asking about antisocial stuff. And so when somebody doesn't give enough responses, then what happens is that we can't generate a number, because we need a kind of a base level to be able to answer it. So it appears, based off of what I'm looking at, that the parent domain life restrictions and relationship with spouse or partner wasn't answered. Now, I will tell you that relationship with spouse or partner, it's possible that he didn't answer those questions. I see this every once in a while because Ms. is no longer a partner. Perception, potentially that would be one way. And then the index of total parent stress was also not answered, which also suggests that it didn't provide enough samples.
So this is a test that Mr. took at home, online, and then he, not knowing which questions were for what category, skipped these questions.
Correct, did not provide answers, that's my understanding.
Okay. Moving on to page 11, we're now talking about the behavioral assessment system for children.
On page 11?
So this page starts at page 10.
Okay.
BASC 3
Yes.
PRQ. Okay, so he reported in average scales for most of it, correct?
Correct,
Okay, but he didn't for relational frustration.
yes.
So tell us about that.
So relational frustration is a measure of looking at how much frustration there may be in a relationship. It's really designed to kind of capture the parent's perspective of the child, a parent-child relationship.
Okay, and then what did it capture?
Frustration, I don't know how else to describe it. It's frustration within the context of a relationship.
Okay, so it says reported losing his patience when dealing with and at times considering difficult to care for.
Yes.
Okay, and is that related to as a baby or is that related to now?
This is an adolescent. This is actually a measure that we use primarily with adolescents. It's asking him to rate his behavior now.
Okay. Did you describe that when his father was angry that his voice would change?
Yes.
How did you describe that voice?
He gave me a couple words about describing it: demonic, evil voice, angry voice. So there wasn't one label. The general what does it mean? Like I tried to get some clarification of what that was. His thought process is it was a demonstration by Dad that he was unhappy, that he didn't like what was going on.
And then what kind of reaction did that create for Brayden?
A lot of anxiety, because he has this underlying anticipatory anxiety, which he at the time was generating, way too many possibilities, including the possibility that Mr. Harmed him.
Are you aware that he missed quite a bit of school after February 4th?
Yes.
Did you talk to him about why that was?
Yes.
And what did he identify?
He was having huge anxiety. He was having panic attacks, huge anxiety response, and he was that parental accommodation that I mentioned earlier was definitely kind of in full swing, with Miss not kind of saying, hey, no, you got to stay in school. No, you got to go to school, and so it just kind of continued to grow.
Okay. On page 13 is where you reach your summary and conclusion. You also give your diagnostic impression.
Yes.
So we already talked about the alcohol use disorder, the cannabis use disorder. You also said adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety and depressed mood. Is that still accurate?
Probably so. I think that he definitely has some anxiety and depression. I didn't find that he met for criteria for like major depressive disorder, but he's also been on an anti-depressive agent for a long period of time, so there may be some level of stability. Adjustment disorders for us are kind of like the common cold. He experiences a lot of anxiety and depression as a result of this this proceeding. This is a huge stressor for him, and so that's why I gave him that diagnosis.
Okay. And then after you received the additional information, were there any other diagnoses that you believe are appropriate?
So in my summary, I'm starting to kind of to describe an interactional pattern, but I didn't have enough evidence based off of what the information I had to come to a conclusion that there potentially is a personality disorder. I believe after reviewing the new evidence that Mr. likely meets a diagnostic criteria for narcissistic personality disorder.
And can you describe why that is?
His interaction, he has this pattern of kind of a grandiose sense of himself, having more power and control over others, little insight to his behavior. When he experiences what we call a narcissistic injury, that's not something he wants, he projects that onto someone else, in some ways trying to make him feel better about the circumstance, blaming others for his mistakes or shortcomings. And just the lack of insight into kind of reading the emotional needs of others.
It's my understanding that you have to have at least five criteria to have a diagnosis of a narcissistic personality disorder.
That's correct.
I'm gonna go through those, you can tell me whether they apply or not. One, you just mentioned, which is the grandiose sense of self-importance. The next is preoccupation with fantasies of success, power, beauty, and idealization. Do you feel like that's appropriate?
I think in an interpretation of making these proceedings open, there's some suggestion here that may be some special power that he would get or some praise that he would get. So I find that to be kind of more partially met.
Okay.
We probably need more data.
Okay. Demanding excessive admiration.
I think a lot of the text messages that I had the opportunity to review just recently really suggest that one of the things that Miss looks like she learned or was part of the process was that if she displayed somewhat when Mr. was upset about something or ruminating about the previous affair, that her response in a admirable way, kind of complimenting him and, you know, you're the best thing since sliced bread. She didn't use those words, but that would tend to settle things down in the conversation.
Okay. Next would be a sense of entitlement.
I think that there's definitely some senses of entitlement about how he would respond to, how people should respond to him, with little consideration about how he should respond to others.
Is that related to the narcissistic injuries that we're discussing?
That is the narcissistic injury.
How about a lack of empathy?
The psychological measures here, cynicism is kind of a correlate to empathy. And on the MMPI, he didn't have elevated levels of cynicism. However, when you go back and really look at the old text messages, especially when he's under a lot of stress, there seems to be a very kind of cynical approach, which seems to have a lack of empathy. I think the lack of empathy is worsened by Mr. inability, or I shouldn't say, he has the ability, difficulty in interpreting emotional content of others and how people are responding.
Envy towards others or belief that others are envious of them.
He definitely has envy towards Miss. There's a number of messages, a little less so now than kind of the older stuff, about how she has more wealth and power and prestige, and that he doesn't have that money anymore. He can't do those things, and so that certainly would be a level of envy.
Okay, and then the arrogant, haughty behaviors and attitude.
He tends to be pretty arrogant at times. Doesn't necessarily consider how other people might respond. And it's more, I don't have, based off, I have a strong suspicion likely. I'd say that's more partial. And I should say that personality disorders are hard to diagnose. And that a lot of times as a psychologist when I was doing treatment, I would really delay personality diagnosis because I learned a long time ago is that personality disorders kind of grow on you. And instead of jumping to the gun that they have a personality disorder, if you meet with them multiple times, you'll start, the personality disorder will kind of emerge itself, especially as they start letting their, letting some of the protections. Because this is, particularly this disorder, this is very, this is a way in which Mr. was trying to really protect his ego and his sense of self, which is probably in many narcissistic individuals is very fragile. And so that fragileness requires a response anytime that there's a threat. Narcissistic injury is just kind of one of the ways we describe it. And so you get an over response versus and the inability to kind of go back. And it becomes almost it becomes a slippery slope, because what happens is that personality disorders are, one way of thinking about personality disorders is that they occur within the context of relationships. And so what happens is over time is the individual's response to other individuals kind of lead lots of messes, lead lots of, I call them, I effectively call it turds. It's like you're leaving all these little turds around, and then people don't want to be around you because you're a turd maker. And I think that that's one of the things that really is kind of going on here. And then how do you fix it? Well, the only way to really fix it is being able to recognize it and having people truly hold a light to you or mirror to you to say it. And that's one of the concerns that I had about the therapist, was that, the time in which he's seen the therapist, she's only got one side of the story. And that's what a therapist does. They are meant to be his advocate, they're meant to listen to his story. But in cases like this, and in personality disorders, the treaters need to be well aware of the issues that have happened in order to be able to help challenge Mr. to make some of these changes to improve the quality of his relationship with his son.
Okay. So then if you turn to page 13, that's your summary and conclusion, and then you make some recommendations. Can you tell, the first recommendation is, the first statement you say is to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty, Mr. is a capable parent who has difficulty understanding the emotional needs, and there's no indication that he would engage in any physical aggression or harm. Do you continue to believe that?
I just want to say that the standard that we use is a pretty low standard when we talk about, a capable parent. At the time in which I wrote this, the physical aggression or harm to the minor child, I believe that. I do have a little bit more reservation about that, given the fact that based off of the new evidence that I read, that I think it's more likely that Mr. did engage in some type of domestic violence, both physical and sexual.
And so then, how does that impact his ability to be a good parent?
Well, one is if we go through the therapeutic process here, now that this proceedings are potentially public, and if he finds out about it, this is a place that's going to have to be processed between Mr. And the minor child. Allegations of putting a gun to his mom's head is going to really potentially. Now, I know Mr. have the responses. It didn't happen. Mom's not being truthful about it. But at the same time, the minor kid's pretty smart, and I think he's going to look at the totality of the situation, and I think there are going to be lots of serious questions that are going to have to be addressed. I also would wonder whether or not his assessment of him being safe, and that dad wouldn't do anything if he finds out about that information, whether or not that's going to alter that calculus.
Now that you say that you do believe that there was sexual and physical domestic violence in addition to the emotional violence, what does that mean as far as safety with the perpetrator of that violence?
We would know that if an individual has engaged in acts of domestic violence in the past, that the past is the best predictor of the future. until appropriate interventions could be placed in order to increase Mr. understanding that that behavior is completely unacceptable in a relationship with the minor child.
Okay. Number two, you say to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty likely has a history of suffering from alcohol use disorder, moderate and recreational use of cannabis, likely negatively impacted his ability to meet the emotional needs. And under that, you make a recommendation that he undergo random 80-hour look-back testing for both substances. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I think the expanding upon that, this was one of the recommendations that I thought was going to be helpful because the minor child put a lot of emphasis on very early out the gate. I just want my dad to be clean. I don't want him to experience this. He recognized that when he is drinking and using marijuana, that he is different, he is altered. And so I was hoping with this recommendation, that this recommendation would be one that would reassure the minor child that dad is working on those areas, because I think he put a lot of weight on that.
What period of time do you think is appropriate for that monitoring to occur?
I would leave that to whoever's treating him. I would tell you that personality disorders tend to be harder to treat, and I would, I think that there's a part here where, unfortunately my crystal ball's broken. I can't tell you how long this is going to take and whether or not this is going to work or not. I would tell the court that I would think that in a 6-month period of time, we should have a good idea what direction we're going in. If the court would recommend or follow through with these recommendations, I think we would have a much better ability to answer that question, particularly about substances. I also would argue to, if Mr. was seeing me for therapy stuff, I tell him to pay for it for as long as we possibly need it, because if it comes up again, I'd love to have that evidence to be able to say, no, that wasn't the case. He could use that in future cases if it's brought up that he was impaired. That's one of the things in these types of relationships that we see where substances are used and there may be conflicts. I have a number of people who, if there's a conflict that happens between between moms and dads or between the kid, we meet. I have them on a drug testing program that allows them to call and go get a look back, because it's really good evidence at the end, if you weren't using, that it wasn't substance related.
Do you have an opinion as to whether the visitation should be modified if there was a positive test for alcohol or marijuana? Even on a short-term basis?
I think that it becomes, it's the calculus of the risk. What's occurring? Are we talking about overnight visits? Are we talking about him supervised therapeutic visits? I think I would have a different response depending on what is the relative risk to the child.
Okay, we talk about that later, so we can talk about that again. Your third recommendation to reasonable degree of certainty is that he would benefit for a forensically oriented therapist who is aware of all the specifics in this case, that allows the therapist to be able to challenge Mr. Beliefs and to develop a better understanding of the whole situation and not just Mr. perspective.
Yes.
Okay. I think that kind of speaks for itself. Are you relating to the fact that Ms. Collins, his current therapist, has been very focused on what Ms. is supposedly doing to him and his reaction?
Yes, and I do think that this is one of those things where I think it's helpful that the therapist, once the therapist has been apprised of the circumstances, and the way I've done this in the past is that we give them a 1-page or 2-page kind of synopsis of what has occurred, and that's their foundation of therapy. And that we don't go back to the therapist unless something blew up or there was some big issue that's happened. That allows the patient to have a therapeutic relationship that's helpful to modify these behaviors of concern.
And you state also in that paragraph that part of the reunification efforts, Mr. individual therapist should be consulted to determine whether she's willing to take on that role of a forensically informed therapist.
Correct.
Okay. And so in saying that, you think that there needs to be reunification therapy here.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm gonna skip over for just a second, but we'll go there just because that's the next, it leads right into that. So under number 5, you're saying that's where you recommend that they would benefit from therapeutic visitation, utilizing a trained psychologist or mental health provider to facilitate the increased understanding. And then you are recommending that that happen in lieu of the Family Peace Center, is that right?
Family Peace Center is just a place to visit. It's not necessarily a therapeutic encounter. The opportunity to help both Mr. and the minor child in their interactions is really needs a skilled psychologist to be able to help them. Kind of like what I did with Mr. bringing him back, kind of gave him a little bit of heads up. Hey, these might be some issues that I want to focus. Like, the minor child was very concerned that Dad was going to dominate the conversation, and so my direction to Mr. is that he should start off this by just listening. Keep your mouth shut. Listen to what your son has to say, which he did. And so that's a good example of the difference between a therapeutic reunification effort versus just hey, let's get them together and see what happens.
So, here we have a motion pending and the court has to make a finding that's now. And so you, as you said earlier, were not retained or appointed to do a custodial evaluation, so you can't make that kind of recommendation. But what, practically speaking, what would it look like for a length of time or a stepped up reunification visitation plan pursuant to your report and recommendation?
It really is going to depend a lot on Mr. response and how he is, how willing he is to move forward. I mean, a little reservation about the fact that he could have done this months ago and chose not to.
You talked to him about it?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about how there were certain pieces that I thought he could stipulate to, and let's start working on some of these things. I mean, that session that we had with the minor child was a great session. It clarified a lot of issues, and what if that was him seeing me for the purposes of reunification, I would have scheduled another appointment probably that same week, because that's the momentum that I want to see kind of grow here. Because I think that Mr. walked away with a little bit of appreciation about concerns. I'm not sure if that stuck or not. I could have find that out if he came back at the end of the week or the beginning of next week. But also we can monitor the minor child's behavior and what changes as a result of it. And so that's what we're hoping. I mean, I think the minor child's anxious response has probably made the situation worse. I'm hoping that the recommendations of the space intervention are going to help address these issues because of the level of parental accommodation that was present. But still, he's got a lot of he's a little anxious worrywart, and I'm concerned that that's going to persist if we don't respond. And Dad has the potential of significantly helping that.
Are you willing to provide that reunification therapy for these people?
If all parties would agree, I would be more than willing, as long as they understand after that I can no longer serve as the expert.
Going back to up to number 4, you talked about that you say that both parties have inadvertently contributed to the underlying resistance and fear of visitation. You talked about parental accommodation. Is there anything more that you feel like you need to add regarding that?
No.
Okay. Number 6, there's a talk about asking to keep secrets. What do you mean by that?
The minor child had indicated that. Dad had asked him before to kind of tell him about what's going on at Mom's house, and that there were things that were secrets. No matter what the evaluational context is, when a kid tells me that one parent's asking to keep a secret, I immediately stop that. That keeping secrets is the way in which abuse and neglect are maintained within family systems. We don't have secrets, we can have surprises, and then we define what those are. So I clarified that up front.
Is asking a child to report on what's happening on the other parent's house a problem?
Yeah, it's a big issue. I mean,
Why is that a problem?
nobody wants to be a rat, and puts him in the middle of a situation, and I think leads to, especially his anxiety. It's like, well, why is Dad asking me this question? What's the purpose? And with the minor child understanding that, the fact that he had this plan that if Mr. came to their house with a weapon, what he would do and how he would respond to that. Asking, where's Mom at when you're at home or stuff like that. Did he interpret that? Little worrywart potentially, where mom is when he gets home, things like that. There's no need for that.
Is that also relevant to the domestic violence history?
It is.
Okay,
It's
can you
power
just-
and control.
Okay. You also made a recommendation that the parties after the therapeutic reunification sessions cease, that they may benefit from a monthly meeting with someone. Do you still believe that?
I do, because I think that their issue. I think that both of them are sometimes have difficulties in seeing what the other one wants. And I think having a mediator once a month to kind of lower some of the stress that they experience may actually help the minor child, because I think the stress that they experience is kind of transferred to the minor kid.
On number 8, you say if possible, the person responsible for therapy visitation should have some limited ability to initiate a return to unsupervised visitation. Do you still agree with that?
I do. I think that there's some limits about under the law about how much that person could, but something that would be scoped out by the court, saying at this point where certain benchmarks or metrics have happened, then we would move to, like I kind of described a little bit. I think the idea initially, these visits are occurring within the context of the office. The therapist is 100% present. That would be followed by having them come to the office. In my place, we put him in the conference room, given his age, have them play some games, maybe a check-in at the beginning, leave them alone, pop in every once in a while, see how things are going. If that goes fine, then the next one is that we, check in with the kid before, and then the parent gets to take them out into the community. We set guidelines for the community, like a public place, and then we get more, giving them more and more opportunities to interact. But the key in this case, in most of the cases, is that ability to check in with the kid at the end to see how things were going and to resolve issues if issues emerge.
Number 9, you're talking about the space program, which you've already discussed. And then number 10, you provided information regarding a book that you thought would be helpful for the parents to use.
Reference the space program, correct?
Right. And this Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD. Did you provide just the title to both of them and suggest they do it?
Yeah, pull up a picture or whatever and show them.
And then I think you said that you testified that Ms. got it and talked to you about it a bit, but you're unsure whether Mr.
Yes, Mr. said that he was going to get it as part of it.
Number 11 is kind of a unique paragraph. You understand that we're here in trial now, and we've asked the court to make a determination with respect to domestic violence. So is that paragraph relevant anymore?
It's a difficult question to answer. I believe that if the court finds that there's domestic violence, then the court needs to find domestic violence. That recommendation was written when it was, somewhat she said, he said, emotional abuse, I believe. And I'm really concerned if the court does find that domestic violence was present, whether or not this is something that Mr. is going to go through a process of rumination, and it's going to impair his ability to work a program so that way he could have a high quality relationship with his son. And ultimately now I really see this is a legal decision. This isn't, this was me being a good psychologist trying to figure out how can I give a roadmap to the court to provide the best opportunity for Mr. to have a relationship with his son.
At the beginning of this, of your work on the parental fitness evaluation, you made an offer to both counsel to have a conversation with you, correct?
Yes,
And did Mr. King respond?
he did not.
Your Honor, we have a statute that says settlement negotiations are not admissible. It's NRS 48.015. I think that's an inappropriate question.
It's in no way referring to settlement negotiations, Your Honor.
I don't hear any settlement negotiations called for. Any other objection? The only question was there an offer to talk? I have no settlement terms or anything like that.
I don't see, I respectfully disagree.
One moment, bear with me. NRS 48.105, just so that council doesn't have to pull it up. You both know that I like to actually look at the rule itself if I'm gonna rule on an evidentiary objection. NRS 48.105 states as follows: evidence of furnishing or offering or promising to furnish or accepting or offering or promising to accept a valuable consideration in compromise or attempting to compromise a claim which was disputed as to validity or amount is not admissible to prove liability for or invalidity of the claim or its amount. Evidence of conduct or statements made in compromise negotiations is likewise not admissible. This section does not require exclusion when the evidence is offered for another purpose, such as proving bias or prejudice of a witness, negativating a contention of undue delay, or proving an effort to obstruct a criminal investigation or prosecution, end quote. How would this go to furnishing or offering a promise or an acceptance of a promise in compromise? It actually doesn't call for any communication specifically, does it, Mr. King?
The question is being presented to infer that the motion should be granted in part for one more reason, that we've been offered this mediation alternative.
That assumes a lot from that question, Your Honor.
It does assume a lot for that question. Mr. King, let me ask it this way. You both know me well enough to know that I have a standard practice in my department of trying to keep costs low in litigation, and I generally say to counsel, if the two of you agree, let's avoid a motion, get me on the phone and I'll call the balls and strikes so that you don't have to file a motion. Sometimes there have been occasions where counsel gets on the phone and says, I attempted to coordinate with opposing counsel and they have not taken the call. I do not take that as they're trying to escalate fees or anything else. I've generally just said that I'm not going to take the call, file your motions. The mere fact that somebody does or doesn't participate just tells me that I am or am not allowed to go forward on the call. It's actually not evidence of a compromise or anything else. So in that same vein, just understand, the only question called for is whether he offered himself for some kind of call to counsel and whether or not counsel responded back to that offer of a call. I have no idea what the offer of the call was about. That's all I take it for. I don't take it as being anything against anyone. It's no different than the filing of an opposition or not filing of an opposition. I don't take it as a compromise. I think it's a stretch to assume that the question goes there. For those reasons, having considered 48.105, the objection is overruled. Anything else for the record, counsel, before we move on?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, go ahead.
You can answer the question. Did you offer both counsel an opportunity to communicate with you at the beginning of your evaluation?
That is my standard practice.
And is it also your standard practice to make yourself available for phone calls from both counsel throughout the evaluation?
I try to avoid them simply because I don't want to get sidetracked as much as possible. If there's a major issue that needs to come up, I usually ask for there to be a conference call.
Okay, and then in the evaluation, the documents that were provided, that you reference in the evaluation, were provided from my side, from Ms. side, is that accurate?
That is correct.
And then from Mr. side, he received that letter from his therapist?
Yes,
Was there anything else that was provided from Mr. side?
not that I recall.
Okay. Okay, Your Honor, I would move to admit Exhibit 1.
Mr. King?
No objection.
Exhibit 1 is deemed admitted. 411. Do you have anything else, Ms.
No
Hardy-Cooper?
further questions.
Okay, Cross,
Yes,